Hello, everyone. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith. It's so lovely to see this room full of faces again. We are just starting to really return to in-person events, so thank you all for coming out. We're thrilled to have you. My name is Bonnie Adderstrom. I'm the Assistant Events Director and a bookseller here at Brookline Booksmith. Tonight, it is our pleasure to host Toba Spitzer to celebrate the launch of God is Here. Yeah. Before I introduce Toba, I just have a few housekeeping notes. Firstly, please keep your masks on and your phone off or on silent for the duration of the event. Thank you for helping make this event enjoyable and safe for everybody. Secondly, copies of God is Here are available for sale in the back. They will be for sale after the event as well. So feel free to head over there at the end. Also, please keep in mind that our event is being live streamed right over there. So if you don't want to be on camera, be careful of crossing in front of that area. And lastly, we will have a Q&A for the final 15 minutes of the event. So hold your questions to the end, but definitely have them ready to go. All right, and now for the introductions. Rabbi Toba Spitzer is a popular teacher of courses on Judaism and economic justice, Reconstructionist Judaism, new approaches to thinking about God, and the practice of integrating Jewish spiritual and ethical teachings into daily life. She served as the president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association from 2007 to 2009, and was the first LGBTQ rabbi to head a national rabbinic organization. She has received the honor of being included in Newsweek's Top 50 Rabbis in America list and the 2010 Forward list of 50 female rabbis who are making a difference. Since 1997, she has been a spiritual leader and part of the community in Newton, Mass. Toba Spitzer's book, God is Here, is a transformative exploration of the idea of God, offering new paths to experiencing the realm of the sacred. Most of us are hungry for a system of meaning to make sense of our lives. Yet traditional religion too often leaves those seeking spiritual sustenance unsatisfied. Rabbi Toba Spitzer understands this problem firsthand and knows that too often it is traditional ideas of the deity. He is too big, too impersonal, and too unbelievable that get in the way. In God is Here, Spitzer argues that whether we believe in God or fervently disbelieve, what we are actually disagreeing about is not God at all, but a metaphor of a big, powerful person that limits our understanding and our spiritual lives. In God is Here, Toba Spitzer inspires us to find new and perhaps surprising ways of encountering the divine right where you are. And without further ado, here she is.
Thank you. Everybody. There are a few people I don't know. A lot of my congregants are here. Dorsey Tzedek should have been in that introduction somewhere. Sorry about that. So wow, this is really exciting. So the publication date is officially tomorrow, actually, but this is my first public event. So those who would like to join me in a Shehecheyanu, please do a blessing for arriving at this moment. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehecheyanu v'kiyamanu v'higyanu l'zman hazeh. Amen. Blessed is the source of life that has kept us in life and sustained us and brought us to this moment. Oh my God, okay. So this is sort of a culmination of an over 10-year journey. And sometimes people ask me like how I got to this particular book. So I wanted to tell you how I got to why this book, because I was not setting out to write a book. And then I'll read a little bit, and then we'll have time for question and answer, and I'll sign books after if you'd like. So, and hello to live streamers if you're there. So, as a Reconstructionist rabbi, really since I was in rabbinical school in the mid-90s, sort of inspired by the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, Mordecai Kaplan, I was like, there's got to be a way of thinking about God, a way of understanding God that will appeal to people who are science-minded, to contemporary Jews who just have a hard time with traditional notions of God. And for a while, I was very engaged with process theology and the notion of God as process. And I was like, this is it. I've discovered the way to think about God, and now all I have to do is make process theology comprehensible to people who don't have 25 PhDs. So that was my task for a little while, because process theology is very abstruse. And then one day I was actually in a bookstore, not this bookstore, in Porter Square Books, and on the table, the staff picks, was a book by James Geary called I Is an Other, something like The Secret Life of Metaphor and How It Shapes the World, something like that. I've been interested in metaphor, and I knew a little bit about the work of George Lakoff from political things. So I bought this book, and it's and in it, Geary sort of synthesizes in very accessible language, the past 20 or 30 years of work on cognitive linguistics. And I'll read a little bit about it, but basically the argument is that as human beings, we interact with the world through metaphor. That we can't avoid it. It's how our brains work, that too much of our experience is complex enough and abstract enough that without concrete metaphors to engage with it, we can't. So we can only really talk about love through metaphors. We can really only talk about time or ideas or anger or all kinds of emotions through metaphor. And the example, and we're in these metaphors without knowing it. Like if I said to you, you commonly are inside the metaphor of anger is a horse, you would be, that's ridiculous. Anger is not a horse. But we rein in our anger. We have unbridled anger. We try to harness our anger. So we're in these metaphors all the time. Time is a precious resource. We waste time. We spend time, and we don't just say these things. We experience that way, right? We're in a doctor's office and we're waiting for 2 hours. We feel like we're wasting time. Not everyone experiences time this way, and most humans did not experience this time this way before the Industrial Revolution. So that's the contention of cognitive linguistics. But my aha moment about God came, Geary in the book talked about analogy of volcanoes for metaphors. So he said there's like an active volcano, there's active metaphors. And those are metaphors that when we read them, we know it's a metaphor. Like in poetry, an example, Mary Oliver poem, The Dark Hug of Time. Like, I know that time can't hug anybody. So I see that metaphor, it's like, oh, that's interesting. What is she trying to say, etc. That's an active metaphor. And then he talked about dormant volcanoes, dormant metaphors. And he argued that a dormant metaphor is a metaphor that we know is a metaphor, but we know exactly what it means as soon as we hear it. I'm up a creek without a paddle. Like, I know and you know that I'm not in a creek or a boat. But, but when I say that in our culture, you know what I'm talking about. And then he talked about extinct metaphors. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson call these metaphors we live by. An extinct metaphor, he said, is a metaphor that's so embedded in our brains and our language and our experience that we have no idea it's a metaphor, and we use them all the time. Very foundational ones. I see what you mean is a metaphor, right? It means I understand you. It has nothing to do with eyesight, but it comes from a very early infant experience that if you don't see something, it's not there, it doesn't exist, right? So I see what you mean. She's a very warm person. This comes from our earliest experiences of being held as infants, and the neurons in our brain that register emotional safety and feelings of protection actually connect to the part of our brains that register physical warmth. And so she's a very warm person, comes to mean, she's caring, So as I was reading about extinct metaphors, and I was like, I had this aha moment. I was like, oh, God is an extinct metaphor. Whenever we in the West, I'm going to limit ourselves to we in the West, other cultures don't have this problem, but whenever we in the West talk about God, and it doesn't matter if we fervently disbelieve in God, or fervently believe, or even aren't sure, whenever we talk about God, whether we believe this or think this or not, we are implicitly talking about God as a big person. Because, and most of the verbs we use, God thinks, talks, argues, loves, hates, punishes, whatever we use, there's this implicit assumption that God is a big person. So suddenly I realized the task is not to come up with the perfect definition for God. The task is to broaden the metaphors that we use. There's nothing inherently wrong with the metaphor of God as a big person, but it limits us, and the thing about metaphor, the other thing that cognitive linguistics suggests is that when we have a complex human experience, we need multiple metaphors. We could never possibly describe love with one metaphor, or even anger, or time, or any sort of profound part of human experience. So human beings have been experiencing the sacred for all of recorded human history and probably before. It's a foundational human experience. And when we go back to ancient texts, including the Hebrew Bible, which is my foundational text, we find like this incredible menu of metaphors, and they're all there, and we know them if we are at all familiar with the Bible, if you're Christian or Jewish. If you're Jewish, we know them in our liturgy. And I just don't think we take them seriously. We treat them as literature. We don't treat them as these are actual ways that our ancestors experienced the divine. So I said, okay, let's check this out. Let's see what happens. And so a lot of people here from Congregation Dorset Tzedek, and some of you were probably in this, but I gave a high holiday talk about this. And then I taught a class, between 30 and 40 people took, and we just started checking it out. So I discovered that water is a very prevalent metaphor for God in the Bible. So we started playing around with what does it mean to think of God as water. Rock, makom, place, what all became chapters in this book. I really didn't know. I didn't know what would happen. And what happened was it was transformative for people. It was very powerful to move beyond God as person and start exploring these non-human metaphors for the divine. So raise your hand if you remember. You guys here in that class? Yeah. And I would just send people out to do weird things like carry rocks around and stuff. Anyway. And it worked. And I was like, okay, there's something here. So I decided to write the book when I've taught it in many settings, not just my congregation. I've had people tell me it's been transformative for them, and I realized I can't teach everybody this, that it has to be beyond me. So that's when I decided to write the book, and you all will tell me if the book succeeds in doing what a more interactive class does. So I thought I'd do tonight is just read a few little sections from the book, and then just open it up for questions. So I'm going to start with water. Water, when I started looking in the Hebrew Bible for metaphors, water was one of the most prevalent. So this is how the chapter about water starts. It's called Drinking from God. The year that he turned 40, my father suffered a massive heart attack. I remember coming home from school that afternoon, I was in 11th grade at the time, and being told by my mother what had happened. It was a total shock. My father was young, strong, seemingly healthy. Heart attacks were things that happened on TV or in the movies, not to me or the people I loved. Thankfully, my father survived. He spent over a month in the hospital and came home a different person than the man who went in. After decades of smoking 1 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day, he became a virulent non-smoker. After years of working long hours and subsisting largely on coffee and cigarettes, he pulled way back on the work hours and watched his diet carefully. Beginning a few months after he got home from the hospital, he would drive out to Calvert Cliffs in Maryland, almost an hour from our house, to walk along the beach and collect shark's teeth and other fossils. He would spend hours there, methodically searching the sand at the base of the cliffs. Wading through the water by the shore, he developed an incredible patience, able to see shark's teeth lying in the sand that to me were invisible. Around the same time, my father took up kayaking. This was the late 1970s and early 80s, before paddling became a popular leisure time activity. To learn how to navigate in whitewater, my dad took a week-long course in North Carolina. He would practice rolling his kayak at the local pool. But even though he ended up joining a boat club where Olympic kayakers trained, he wasn't trying to become competitive. He simply loved being out on the Potomac River, whether paddling through flat water or floating down the rapids. And like many recent converts, he was a fervent proselytizer. He would take my brother and me out on the river with him any chance that he got, doing all he could to impart his love of the river to us. He loved to take friends and acquaintances out on the water as well. Long after he'd given up his walks at the Calvert Cliffs, kayaking remained his passion. A few years before his death from a second heart attack at the age of 64, he became president of the American Canoe Association, spreading his gospel of salvation through floating on rivers. So I go on to talk a little bit about the role that water plays in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and this part is called Drinking from God. I grew up in Maryland, where access to water was never an issue. There was plenty of rain year-round, and so much humidity in the summer you could practically drink the air. Then at the age of 18, I went to spend a year in Israel, living on a kibbutz in the Negev desert. Suddenly, water was a precious resource. Rain only fell in the winter months, and in the orchards where I worked, the trees were sustained by miles of drip irrigation tubes. It was hot but dry in the summer, and we Americans had to be constantly reminded to drink. I remember our first hike in the desert, stopping to take a drink from my canteen. I didn't even realize until the water hit my mouth how incredibly thirsty I was. It is hard to express how deeply satisfying that canteen of lukewarm water was in that moment. That experience comes to mind as I read biblical passages where the author speaks of thirsting for God and drinking from a godly well or stream. These are quotes from Psalms. How precious is your love, O God. Humanity is nourished from the riches of your house. You give them drink from the stream of your delight. Elohim, you are my God. I seek you, my soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. As the deer longs for water streams, so does my soul long for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When I think of my father walking along the water's edge by the Calvert Cliffs, or paddling on the Potomac, I wonder if his soul was drinking in some kind of spiritual sustenance, even as his physical self was enjoying the literal waters. I know that this metaphor of a thirsty soul resonates with me. It is an accurate description of those times when I feel spiritually dry, as if some essential source of nourishment has been cut off. In those moments, I am like that deer in the Judean desert, searching for an afik, a channel in the earth that fills when it rains. At these times, God is the source from which my thirsty soul can be quenched, if only I am willing to drink. In the words of the prophet Isaiah, I can be like that orchard in the Negev, nourished by godly waters. Adonai shall guide you always and satisfy your soul in drought, and you shall be like a watered garden. So I go on to talk about this water metaphor in a few ways, and then each chapter has practices to help bring the metaphor alive. Because what I also found was that we can't just read about the metaphors, we have to sort of reactivate them, because this other metaphor of God as a big person is so deeply embedded in our brains that to bring the other ones alive, we have to have practices to do so. I'm going to read a little bit. I want to just share a little bit about a few other metaphors just to give you a flavor, and then we'll talk a little bit. So this is from the chapter on rock, God as rock. Many people I know are drawn to rocks, whether water-smooth pebbles on the beach or polished stones in a shop. One of the most beautiful and unique gifts I received when I was ordained as a rabbi was a geode filled with bright blue crystals, which sits on my desk and reminds me that, as my friend wrote in her card, at the core we sparkle. Tucked into my closet is a box filled with stones and shells collected in my travels with my spouse Gina. Taking a tiny bit of earth away from a place I visited always feels like a meaningful kind of connection. Reflecting on the appeal of rocks, Patricia Adams Farmer writes that, quote, "The energy of rocks is particularly mysterious and primordial. A rock radiates a personality of something strong and trustworthy, and forever present in the world, remaining long after we are gone. A rock is very sure of itself, of its past and its future, and it has reason to be. When we pick up a rock, we are not just holding a lump of minerals, we are holding a piece of eternity in our hands." End quote. One of the rock names of God in the Bible, Sur Olamim, captures this sense of eternity. It is sometimes translated Rock of Ages, and can also be translated as Everlasting Rock or Ancient Rock. When I first visited the Judean desert as a teenager, I was deeply moved by the landscape, which is dominated by limestone mountains from the late Cretaceous period, 70 to 80 million years old. I climbed one of the mountains near Ein Gedi and found a rock outcropping that offered protection from the sun. Sitting beneath this rock, looking out at the Judean hills, I mused on what it must have been like to try to survive in such a harsh environment. The landscape felt paradoxically welcoming and challenging, all at the same time. Viewing the layers upon layers of rock in a mountainside millions of years old, I felt the sense of vastness in time and in space that gives mountains their sacred quality. and I also experienced a deep sense of connection with the earth's history. In his commentary to the opening verse of Psalm 95, "Let us sing to God, make a joyful noise to the rock of our liberation," Dr. Arthur Walker Jones writes, quote, "Like all planets, Earth grew when stardust coalesced into larger and larger bodies of rock. Rock forms both earth and mountains. Lava from volcanoes creates land. Soil erodes from rock and allows for the growth of plants. Animals are made up of minerals from earth and rely on minerals from plants and other animals. Rock surrounds and cradles the sea. In brief, Psalm 95 identifies God with earth and allows for an ecological understanding of the Creator as part of creation, as God in earth." End quote. The earth-centric understanding of God that Walker Jones celebrates here also helps connect us to an earthy experience of the sacred. We, like all animals, are made up of minerals from the earth. God in earth is also God in us. I'm going to read one last part. So the biblical metaphors I explore are water, rock, voice, place, which is rabbinic, cloud, and fire, and then God as process or becoming. The last chapter I wanted to explore some modern metaphors, and I chose electricity and GPS. So I'm going to read a little bit about electricity. A few years into my rabbinate, I was on a retreat with about 30 other rabbis from across the Jewish denominations. On the opening night, we did a get-to-know-you exercise in which we had a series of 3-minute conversations with one another, each with a different prompt. As I moved around the circle of colleagues, I prepared to answer the question, if you hadn't become a rabbi, and money or ability or prerequisite knowledge was not an issue, what would you have been? I was pretty sure I was going to say I had been a community organizer. I had worked in a variety of progressive organizations before going to rabbinical school, and I identified as a social justice activist. So imagine my surprise when it was my turn to answer this question, and what came out of my mouth was, I would have been a physicist. The reason I found this completely surprising is that I am terrible at math and never got anywhere near a physics class in my high school or college years. There is no one less likely to have become a physicist than I. But after I gave my answer, I realized that I do share something with those who are blessed to do physics, a sense of wonder at the universe, and a deep desire to understand how things work. As a rabbi, I get to engage in big questions, and I seek to discern some kind of meaningful order in what often feels like a disordered, chaotic world. I want to know what makes us tick, and what the larger context is for human existence. And while I can't really fathom what physicists do, I wonder if some of the same desires and curiosities are at play. When I read the Hebrew Bible, I imagine that its authors were sort of like me, and sort of like modern physicists, seeking answers to how the cosmos works and what our place in it is. Their experience of the divine was part of that exploration, was in fact inseparable from it. Science offers metaphors that help me understand some of the more challenging aspects of the biblical portrayal of God. Among the most difficult stories in the Bible are those in which seemingly unsuspecting characters get zapped by God. A good example is the story of Nadav and Avihu. Aaron's oldest sons make an unauthorized offering at the altar and are immediately consumed by the divine fire. Something similar happens in the book of Samuel, when King David attempts to bring the Ark of the Covenant, a gold box holding the stone tablets that Moses received at Sinai, to his capital city of Jerusalem. The Ark is being transported on an ox cart, and when the oxen stumble, one of the men guiding the cart, a guy named Uzzah, reaches out to steady the Ark. When he touches it, God is incensed and strikes him down, and Uzzah dies. This story seems even worse than the episode with Nadav and Avihu. They at least could be accused of making a dubious offering in an irresponsible way. All that poor Uzzah did was try to keep the holy ark from falling out of a cart. Why in the world would God strike him down? Earlier in the Bible, the Israelites are warned that only the tribe of the Levites are authorized to transport the various items of the Mishkan, the holy tabernacle. And the men responsible for transporting the ark, via a set of poles fastened to rings on its sides, have to be extremely careful not to actually touch it, or they will die. When God strikes Uzzah in the story of the ox cart, it seems to be the unavoidable consequence of someone touching a holy object that is profoundly dangerous to humans. The best that I can understand how the ancient Israelites understood this holy danger is through the metaphor of electricity. The Holy of Holies at the center of the Mishkan housed the Ark, which functions something like the core of a nuclear reactor, supplying the sacred energy that was then channeled by the priests through their rituals. Just as enormous precautions have to be taken to safely make use of nuclear energy, so too did those who interacted with the Mishkan and the Ark at its center have to take extreme care not to get zapped. When the book of Samuel describes God being incensed when Uzzah touches the Ark, we can understand it less as the emotion of anger and more like a natural physical reaction. It's akin to me being able to safely use the electric power that is supplied to my home as long as it is wired and grounded properly. I need to avoid sticking my finger in a socket. Hapless Uzzah had the best of intentions, but by touching the Ark, he did the biblical equivalent of holding up a metal rod in a lightning storm and got a shock that took his life. The question remains, why did the authors of the Bible perceive godly power as so inherently dangerous? What truth were they trying to convey in these metaphors of fire and electricity and the stories of zapping that happens to people both innocent and guilty? My answer is that the biblical authors were acknowledging a simple reality. To be alive is pretty damn scary. We exist in a universe that is largely, even today, beyond our understanding. We are often at the mercy of forces we cannot control. The ancients were very honest about God, and the Bible is not a Hallmark reading card. It is a holy, sometimes contradictory muddle of beauty and horror, love and pain, hope and hopelessness, a lot like life. And somewhere within and behind all of this complexity is Yud He Vav He, the source of life itself. As the prophet Isaiah audaciously declared, quote, forming light and creating darkness, making peace and creating destruction, I, God, do all these things. There is only one power source of the universe, the prophet teaches. It manifests in that which we find pleasant and in that which scares us. It both sustains us and makes us mortal. And just as with electrical current, if we don't properly channel that divine power, we can generate some severe shocks. As the world witnessed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, when human beings start playing with the primal energies of the universe, we take on godlike powers of both creation and destruction. Perhaps the Bible was right in warning us that there are some things that we humans should just not touch. I think I'll pause there. Questions? So again, with each of these metaphors, there's a lot of different texts. I had so much material, but I include text, and then like I said, sort of practices for each of the metaphors. Thoughts, questions, reactions?
So as Toba calls on folks, I'm going to be walking around to hand off the mic so we can all hear you, so no one has to shout. So go ahead with hands.
Dan, yes.
Well, just to prime the pump, to use a metaphor. Just a simple question.
Yeah.
Why then has the anthropomorphic metaphor been the dominant one, do you think?
That's a great question. There's a wonderful article that I cite in here by a Reconstructionist colleague, David Stein, who talks about in the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, every divinity had a mineral, an animal, a plant, like had all these manifestations. So I think it was, and I think this, and I'm convinced like that our biblical ancestors used all these different names of God, and they are names like Makor Mayim Chaim, and the prophets use, fount of living waters, Peleg Elohim, river of God. I'm convinced they use these in prayer and worship and in their own personal lives. I don't know. It's unclear what happened. I think there's a wonderful book I quote here that I would recommend called The God of Old by James Kogel, which is like the best name for a Jewish biblical scholar. And in it he tried, and so he's a biblical scholar far beyond anything I can attempt to do. He calls it the God of Old. He tries to find the oldest texts in the Torah and the Bible and see how our ancestors experience the divine, and he sees it as like the line between the sacred and our world was very thin and could be penetrated at any moment. And sometime after the destruction of the temple and the exile to Babylonia, he sort of feels like maybe out of that trauma, God sort of became a distant emperor, and we sort of got stuck with the distant emperor God. But the texts are still there. But certainly by the rabbinic period, the rabbis don't use any of those metaphors anymore. So even pre-modern times, it seems like it got limited. And then Greek philosophy happened, and I blame, sort of infection of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam with Greek philosophy that turned God into a complete abstraction. So I don't know, but the question of why we take so seriously the human metaphors and not these other metaphors that are right there on the page, I don't know how that happened or when it happened, but sometime between the closing of the Bible and the opening of the rabbinic period, it seems like it had happened, and I don't know why. Yeah, Louise.
So you talk about wanting to expand people's experience of the divine through shedding light on these various metaphors, and you talk about providing some exercises in the book. Can you say something more about the spiritual impact that you hope to bring to people with this teaching?
Yeah. So what's the spiritual impact? So I'll give you an example from that first class we did. And it involved someone who I don't even really know her. She wasn't a congregant, and I forget her name actually. She just came for that class. And if she's here, you can come up to me afterwards. So we were studying the rabbinic metaphor of makom, which means place. It's very interesting. God is not called makom in the Bible. There's places where there's that word makom appears in relation to God, but it's not a name of God. By the time of the Mishnah, about 200 CE of the Common Era, the Mishnah is just like hamakom, just God is place. So at some point that became a name of God, and the rabbis, and it connotes a nearness, a sense of God's nearness and God in any place. So in the class we would, explore our own connections to place. We looked at texts about place, and then I sort of sent people off to do some, for the week. And then when we came back, this person shared that she went to services at another synagogue. She said, whenever we get to the Shema, which is the sort of the central prayer where we say Adonai Echad, God is one. She said, whenever I get to that prayer, I usually I don't say it because I don't believe in God, and I just feel very, I like services, but I just can't say it because I don't believe in God. She said, but I resonate very strongly with place. And she said, so all during the service, I was just thinking about makom and bringing together images of places I've been that are important to me. And then when we got to Shema, I brought all those places together in my mind, and I said Adonai Echad, and she said I had an experience I've never had before of God. So I was like, and it's not that I would say that you should go do that, but just that's how that metaphor resonated for her, and for other people it might be chanting about God as water, or it might be holding onto a rock, and when we need a sense of refuge. So the way the metaphor works, the way, according to the cognitive linguists, I think, if there are any actual cognitive linguists here, please correct me. I'm not, but in my very layperson understanding, metaphors, there's the source and the target. The target is the abstract concept or experience we're trying to get at, so God would be the target. The source is always an embodied experience. So I think people say to me, like, is love a metaphor for God? I'm like, not really, because love is also abstract. So metaphors have to be based in our embodied experience, so a place, voice, water, fire. And so I think why this is powerful and why this has been powerful for people is because it links us to an experience that we all have. And Judaism was originally indigenous. I mean, these were people in a place where they had a profound connection to the land, to the water, so these aren't, unique to our tradition, because every culture has those. But it takes us back, I think, to that very embodied experience, which is why I think it works for people. And, as I say in the book, if the word God doesn't work for you, don't use it. Like, there's no reason to use that word if you don't like it. It's a Germanic word, and I suggest names, like, there's different names. Like, use what works for you. But I think the book is for anybody, but I think it's especially for people who don't even get as far as joining a synagogue or a church because the whole thing seems so ridiculous. Why would I even do that? And then you cut yourself off from all these practices that we have that could be so powerful. So I forget what the question was, and I don't know if I answered it. So you can be rolling, Louise.
So Toba, there's a funny thing that comes up when you talked about the story of touching the ark and being damaged, which is the ark is not God, just like the column that Abraham erected was not God, but somehow it feels like there's this additional metaphor of, is God this thing, or is God somehow present in this thing or brought about by this thing? Is there anything that you sort of explored in that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Metaphors are not definitions, and I think this is really hard for us. Like, we want things to be things, like X equals Y. That's not how a metaphor works. Like, anger exists. Anger is not a horse. But if I can convey something about, and I cannot define anger, right? I can say my body temperature goes up. I can say, if you tried to actually define anger, you couldn't. You'd have to use metaphors to get at it. So I suggest that God exists because it's a foundational human experience that all people in all times have had. But we can only get at it through metaphor, and our ancestors and I think our ancients knew this better than we do, and so they told it through stories. Where or what is God in that moment of touching the ark, I don't know. But clearly there's some kind of divine energy that is housed there that I think we as moderns can only get at through the metaphor of electricity or something akin to that. And I think we want metaphors to be definitions. Like when I've taught this in sort of a one evening or one session program, there's always somebody who says, yeah, but it's not really God. And what they mean is, God is like this because this metaphor I have of God is a definition. And again, we've got like 2,000 years of like scholastic arguments in Christianity and Judaism, Islam, trying to prove God's existence. I really feel like it's 2,000 years of completely wasted effort. I'm really sorry that we as humans, really, it's like, oh my God, it's arguing. And we could have been having like wonderful experiences. It makes me really sad. There's nothing to, because I don't need to prove you anger exists. I don't need to prove you love exists. And if you've never felt love, I feel sorry for you, but I can't prove it to you if you've never experienced it. So my hope is through the metaphors that, it opens up experience for people. And the different, and in the cloud chapter, I talk about, well, actually, let me read you the cloud, read you a little bit about cloud. Just trying to get at this. All right, cloud. In the early months of 2020, I was on sabbatical, taking a few months off from my congregational work to focus on writing this book. I returned on March 10th, just in time for the Jewish holiday of Purim and a big Purim party. 5 days later, the congregation, along with much of Massachusetts, was physically shut down due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Those first few weeks brought many challenges and a lot of learning. I had to figure out how to lead Shabbat services via Zoom, how to guide and comfort congregants unable to be physically present with their ill and dying parents, how to create B'nai Mitzvah ceremonies with me in one place and the family in another. The question that accompanied me in all of my work with my congregation was this: how do we foster a sense of closeness to one another, to our community, to Jewish practice, when we can't be physically close? That spring, as I taught a Zoom class about God in metaphor, I realized that this same question was very much alive for my biblical ancestors. They seem to have experienced Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, or biblical name for God, as a presence that could be closely felt, yet could not be held in a material object, in an idol made of metal or wood or clay. The divine could be glimpsed but not fully seen, heard but not entirely comprehended, encountered but not contained. With the metaphor of cloud, the biblical authors found a way to convey a sense of nearness to something close by that cannot be touched. And then I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. During a family vacation in Puerto Rico, Gina and I took our kids for a hike in El Yunque National Forest, a tropical rainforest in the Luquillo Mountains. It is a beautiful area, sacred to the indigenous Taino people. We climbed up the El Yunque peak, and arriving at the top, felt disappointed when we couldn't see anything at all. The view was completely obscured by clouds as we sat and rested on the rocks. We were about to give up and head back when all of a sudden the clouds swept away and we found ourselves gazing at a magnificent panorama. A few minutes later, the clouds returned and we could barely see a foot in front of us. Dense fog and then a view, fog and then view. This magical oscillation continued as we sat within the cloud. It is in the nature of clouds to obscure things from view while also making something that is usually invisible visible. As the folks at NASA explain, quote, "Water vapor is always in the sky in some amount, but is invisible. Clouds form when an area of air becomes cooler until the water vapor there condenses to liquid form. At that point, the air is said to be saturated with water vapor. The air where the cloud forms must be cool enough for the water vapor to condense. The water will condense around things like dust, ice, or sea salt, all known as condensation nuclei. The temperature, wind, and other conditions where a cloud forms determine what type of cloud it will be." End quote. The authors of the Bible most likely did not know all of the science behind the formation of clouds, but they understood an aspect of reality that this scientific definition of clouds makes clear: that something life-sustaining and ever-present, whether water vapor or the divine, can be both unseen and very much there. Indeed, it is when the water vapor in the atmosphere both cools down and interacts with other objects in the atmosphere, dust, ice, salt, that it becomes visible as a cloud. So too, the biblical texts about God as cloud imply that God's invisible presence becomes visible when it interacts with human beings. And then I go on to bring some things. So that's what I'm saying, it's a metaphor. Like, God is not a cloud, but this image of the cloud, and that the cloud is always what descends or is present, or the cloud talks to Moses face to face like a friend. Like, they're trying to convey something that's not conveyable, and they're using metaphor to do it. So I think that's the argument I'm making. But and then I'm going a step further and saying if we take the metaphors as seriously as they do, we can actually get something out of this. That's sort of and that's, I think, other people have written about God in metaphor. I'm by no means the first person to do that. I think, it doesn't matter if I'm the first or not. I think in this book what I'm trying to do is say, let's just dive right in and let's do it. Let's stop talking about it and let's just go for it, So that's sort of the, yeah. So you have a few more minutes, other folks.
I'm a little intimidated. Hopefully I won't mess this up, but you talked about Moses and God in the cloud, and when I'm thinking about metaphors for God, I think two kind of opposite things come to mind, because eventually Moses asks, well, why can't I look at your face? And then God says, well, I am who I am. Kind of beyond tenses that we use. And then if you go all the way back to the beginning, when God creates humanity, the humanity is created in the image of God. So we've got this metaphor in some ways of beyond the big bearded guy in the sky, which I just find troubling to even get to a mirror reflection of us, but something so big that we can't even look at it, but it is. So I'm not quite sure where I'm going for that, but you just made me think of it with your story of Moses and the cloud.
Which is when I started exploring God as water. Maybe that's what the Selam Elohim, maybe that's what it means. Why do we read as arms and legs? We're 80% water. Maybe it's the metaphor that speaks to being in God's image. That's why the metaphors are so wonderful, because they let us in. And I would invite you not to think of it as big and beyond us. I would instead say we need here, I'll tell you what we need. I'll tell you what we need. Many years ago, I worked in an ice cream store in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Some of you have heard this story. On any given day, it was Christina's, by the way. On any given day, we had over 20 flavors of ice cream available, and we were always experimenting with new ones. One day, a father and his young son came into the store. The little boy, not yet able to read, asked his dad, "What flavors are there?" The father looked up at our wonderful list of flavors of the day and answered, "There's chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry." While I sympathized with the dad trying to not overwhelm his child with too many choices, I felt so sad for that little boy. Here was a diverse world of marvelous ice cream flavors, hidden from him only because he couldn't read. It's how I feel about most people's experience of God metaphors. If our only flavor choices are God is a distant ruler or God is an all-powerful and perfect being that we can't really understand, I'd probably walk out of the store. But the happy reality is that our religious traditions offer the equivalent of Baskin-Robbins' 31 flavors when it comes to metaphors for God, and nothing is stopping us from discovering new metaphors that are relevant, powerful, and meaningful to our lives today. And that's what is so wonderful. There's so many, like you named like 4 or 5 metaphors just in the little bit that you said, and I think that's the invitation here is to, and again, and they're all sort of all true at the same time, and we can only inhabit one at a time. And at any given time, one might resonate, more or less, which is why when I teach this, even if I only have 75 minutes or 90 minutes, I always teach more than one metaphor, because I don't want people leaving and saying, "Oh, God is water, now I get it." It's like, no. And water is really different than rock, is really different than place, is really different than voice, is really different than ehia, becoming. So, and they all speak to different, aspects of our experience.
Right. I guess my point was, you can't look on God yet. Humanity is made in the image of God, and how can that be without encompassing something bigger than, it's not like it's unattainable because we are in the image, but we can't look at the image.
We can get it part of it at a time, I would say.
Yeah.
We can get part of it at a time. Yeah. Other folks,
Where you
okay,
can
on this side of
see
the
the
room, yeah.
reflection of God in the
Yeah.
water that looks back at you.
I was curious if you had
Or in all of
any
humanity.
use for the traditional metaphor of the anthropomorphic metaphor, like if that is powerful in any way, or if there's a way into it that's not. I think it's so, it's usually very patriarchal, and so nowadays it feels so unmodern, but I'm wondering whether there's any uses for that original metaphor or ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, again, I don't think it's original. I think it's one of many, but I think, look, there's many human metaphors for the divine that are very beautiful. Parent, teacher, lover. I wouldn't ever, no, I don't think I want us to get rid of a metaphor. I think we do have to, every metaphor that lifts up certain aspects of the divine, and especially when it comes to godly power, I think we have to be careful. And I think, unfortunately, the metaphor as God as sort of commander-in-chief promotes an idea of power that's power over, what theologians call coercive power. When we start calling that kind of power godly, it means that it's godly to act that way, and then we're sort of valorizing tyrannical power. So that would be my one critique, is that, how we think about power is important. Now, and so in the chapter about water, I talk about looking at justice and power through the lens of water, and how the power of water is very different than as a human. But there's nothing wrong with human metaphors of the divine, and I'm going to be really curious and excited to see how people from non-Jewish traditions, obviously Christianity, the human metaphor is central and powerful, so I would not want to dislodge that for anybody, and Christians also have the Hebrew Bible, so they have these other metaphors, but, so I think, maybe there's a time when I want to feel like, God is a parent, male or female, or non-gendered, or, the teacher, there's very, like, the songs and imagining our relationship to God through an erotic, sexual thing, powerful. So I don't think it's about getting rid of that, but because the human one is what is an obstacle for so many people, I, in this book, wanted to really focus on the non-human. And there's been a lot more work done by feminist theologians and writers around the feminine, which is a whole other realm of experience that, is rich. Anybody else? Those are fabulous questions. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey there, good to see you.
So I was raised in a very scientific household, so I have a tendency to overanalyze everything from every angle. And finding God in Judaism has been a big thing in my life recently. But because of that scientific background, I feel inclined to ask, was there anywhere you found God wasn't, or any metaphor that just didn't quite work out? Or if there's just like anything along those lines that you can think of.
Yeah, I don't think any metaphor could work. It's a great question. I mean, most, except for the two modern ones, the GPS and the electricity, I started with metaphors that existed in our tradition, and then I just sort of delved into them and to see, like, where does this take me? I didn't know at the beginning if it would, like God as rock was not something I immediately resonated with. But then, like, I started, like, noticing rocks, and I started noticing where they're used, and I went to the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, where, to commemorate lynching, they're asking people to, like, put earth in jars, and, like, it was all of a sudden I was noticing all of this. So certainly all the ones I explored from Tanakh, from Hebrew Bible, were powerful, and then I, explored Makom from the rabbinic tradition, place, and then the modern ones, I didn't make up God's electricity. I had heard that, so I decided to explore it, and I'd always had this idea about GPS, godly positioning systems, so I wanted to play. But again, I didn't even know how GPS worked. So first I had to, like, go Google, like, what is GPS and how does it work, and then I was like, oh, this is sort of cool, it does work. So could there be a metaphor that doesn't work? I don't know, but that's what's sort of fun about this is, like, play with it, like, see, find a thing in your embodied experience that's powerful to you, and then see where it takes you. A metaphor can't be wrong. That's the thing. It cannot resonate. It cannot work. It could potentially have bad implications. So we have to think about that. But it's not a definition, so it can't be wrong. And that's what's so wonderful. That's why I sort of like all this debate about right, wrong, exist, not exist. And there are people who think about science that way. I found when I was studying process theology, I came across, let me see if I can find this quote. I came across scientists who write about metaphor. And think, science is shaped by metaphor too, so it's not just, this kind of stuff, but there's this great quote, let me see if I can find it. Theodore Brown wrote a book about science and metaphor, and he said, as the scientist and author Theodore Brown observes in his exploration of the role of conceptual metaphor in the work of science, quote, in this way of looking at things, truth is the product of human reasoning. It follows that science does not proceed by discovering pre-existing truths about the world. Rather, it consists in observing the world and formulating truths about it. And then I just put the word religion in. It follows that religion does not proceed by discovering pre-existing truths about the world. Rather, it consists in observing the world and formulating truths about it. So I think religion functions similarly. It's our observation and our experience, and then the metaphors bring it to life in some way. All right, maybe one more, and then I'll sign books. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Linda.
I was wondering whether going through writing this book has changed your own personal experience of prayer, spiritual life. Like, how has it impacted you personally? Or are you still too much in the middle of it to sort of have landed somewhere?
Yeah, can I answer with a little piece of the book? So, yesterday was my spouse Gina's 6th secular Yortzeit, and her Jewish Yortzeit was last week. So in her memory, I'll read this, but it very much goes to your question. I found the metaphor of God as water to be enormously helpful during some of the most challenging months of my life. In the spring of 2014, my spouse Gina was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. After a year of experimental treatments and in the fall of 2015, things took a turn for the worse, and she died the following March. Those months leading up to her death, during which she endured a nasty course of chemotherapy, were profoundly difficult. I needed every ounce of strength and compassion I could find to be a support to Gina, and to keep from being overwhelmed by sadness and despair. During this journey, I found myself drawn to a chant composed by my colleague and teacher, Rabbi Shefa Gold, a setting of a verse from the book of Isaiah. When you pass through the waters, I am with you. I won't let the rivers overwhelm you. Chanting these words, I realized the profound insight of this verse. As I struggled to understand where God was in the terrible reality I was facing, I realized that water is essential to life. Indeed, water is life, and yet sometimes it is also that which threatens me, overwhelms me, drowns me. God was at one and the same time the waters through which I was passing, and that which supported me as I made my way through an unbearable reality. Facing the prospect of the death of my beloved, I didn't rail against the unfairness of an inscrutable God who had brought suffering into my life. Instead, in the slow motion heartbreak of that terrible year, I did my best to sit with the reality that ultimately faces each and every one of us. I remembered my father's instruction to lean into, not away from, the turbulence when navigating a kayak through the rapids. I understood that the waves can be overwhelming and terrifying, and yet within them is the godly presence that sustains and supports me, even in the most difficult moments. I gave myself over to overwhelming waters, allowing myself to feel the profound sorrow within them, even as I sought the reassurance of God's presence accompanying me as I made my way down the river. So the answer is yes. Cool, thank you guys so much. I'll sit over there, I'll put my mask back on, and if I think if people got a book with their ticket, you can pick it up over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Buy
So-
one for your friends, I don't know.
Exactly. So I will be in the back by that counter there. If you haven't already picked up your book, feel free to meet me over there. And as we make the signing line, if we could have it down to the right of these poles in the center here, leading to the table, and then that way we can keep the space free to walk in. Thank you everyone so much.
And if I space on your name, it's because of Kogel.
Thank you.